Tensions are rising rapidly between Canada and the United States, sparked by the Trump administration's recent tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and potentially automotive goods. Canada has announced significant retaliatory tariffs, and politicians are openly discussing even more dramatic measures, including cutting off oil exports to the United States. 1 month ago, former President Trump paused the 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, but tensions have resurfaced with threats from Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who recently suggested Canada might shut off oil shipments as retaliation. While these comments might sound extreme or even exaggerated, local Canadian media calls Oil Canada's Trump card an economic weapon it could use against escalating U.S. tariffs. Canada has already announced it will impose retaliatory tariffs on over $100 billion worth of American goods within the next 3 weeks. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau confirmed this stance, saying that Canada is not just planning tariff-based retaliation, but also considering non-tariff measures targeting critical minerals, energy, and other strategic sectors. In practice, this includes potentially imposing export tariffs on minerals essential for U.S. industries, banning American companies from Canadian government contracts, and even removing American liquor from store shelves. But the most significant threat discussed by Canadian officials remains oil. Over 90% of Canada's crude oil exports currently go directly to the United States, primarily feeding refineries in the Midwest and Gulf Coast regions. Canadian officials argue this deep integration gives Canada a major economic trump card. In fact, Doug Ford explicitly stated he's ready to halt energy exports if the U.S. implements Trump's proposed tariffs permanently. Yet, the question remains, how realistic is Canada's threat? Critics argue it's merely diplomatic posturing, a bluff meant to put pressure on Trump. After all, Canadian oil exports to the United States are critical to Canada's economy, and any significant disruption could severely damage both sides. Pipelines and cross-border energy infrastructure have intertwined the two countries' economies for decades. Over 90% of Canada's crude oil goes straight to U.S. refineries, especially from the oil-rich provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Experts point out that shifting or redirecting these massive energy flows isn't something Canada could easily or quickly accomplish. Moreover, pipeline infrastructure between the two countries was developed over decades, some dating back to the 1950s, specifically to integrate Canadian production with U.S. refineries. This energy integration is part of broader economic cooperation, first established under the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, in 1994, and largely retained under its successor, the USMCA. Both countries depend heavily on this relationship, with about 90% of Canadian crude flowing into the U.S., and Canada supplying around 60% of U.S. oil imports in recent years. Halting these flows would cause immediate economic pain on both sides of the border. However, Canada's politicians argue that they're prepared for long-term adjustments if Trump continues pushing aggressive tariffs. While pipeline companies like Enbridge acknowledge it's impractical to reroute pipelines for short-term political tensions, the idea of constructing new infrastructure to export to Asia is not entirely off the table. If tariffs become permanent, Canada might begin seriously exploring ways to export oil to markets beyond North America, including Asia or Europe. Even though this scenario seems unlikely in the short term, the conversation itself demonstrates how strained relations between these close allies have become. Trump's America First approach, especially aggressive tariffs on steel, aluminum, and potentially automotive products, has significantly eroded trust. Canadian patience appears to be wearing thin, with politicians feeling forced into openly discussing dramatic retaliatory options. The debate continues in Canada over whether these threats are realistic or simply diplomatic maneuvers. Many believe Canada is using the threat of cutting oil exports as leverage, a negotiation tactic meant to force Trump into reconsidering his tariff strategy. However, others suggest Canada may genuinely consider these drastic moves if Trump remains stubborn. From the American perspective, confidence in domestic shale oil production might be fueling Trump's aggressive stance. But experts caution that American refineries, particularly in the Midwest, are highly dependent on Canadian heavy crude oil. Switching to alternative sources like Middle Eastern oil overnight isn't feasible due to refinery compatibility issues. Thus, cutting off Canadian oil would result in significant short-term disruptions for U.S. refineries, likely causing a spike in fuel prices and economic damage. Ultimately, both nations stand to lose if this escalates into a full-blown trade war. Emotional and political moves in a trade conflict can quickly spiral, leading to unintended economic damage. For now, Canada is using the oil threat to strengthen its diplomatic hand, hoping Trump might reconsider his stance or moderate negotiations. Some analysts predict that Trump's administration might eventually back down, recognizing the mutual dependency between the two economies. Yet others worry that the administration's confidence, or perhaps overconfidence, in domestic shale production might prolong the conflict, prompting Canada to genuinely consider diversifying markets by turning toward Asia or Europe. No matter what happens next, this conflict highlights a new level of distrust between Canada and the United States, something unimaginable just a few years ago. The possibility of a prolonged trade war, especially involving something as critical as oil, could reshape North America's economic landscape. Ultimately, while both sides might be bluffing or leveraging strong language for negotiation, this escalating tension reveals a deeper fracture in U.S.-Canada relations. Whether Canada would ever fully shut off the oil supply to the United States remains uncertain. Still, this crisis underscores the shifting dynamics of global trade and energy politics, particularly when powerful economies clash. As these tensions unfold, one thing is clear. The threat of Canada cutting oil exports, once unimaginable, is now firmly part of the diplomatic playbook. Stay tuned, because this geopolitical drama is far from over.